Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special report. I wanted to talk a little bit today about the goddesses in, um, my YouTube channel. You can find an introduction to my class series, The Goddess Within, where I gave um, basic introduction to all of the major asteroid goddesses that I work with. Those are Juno, Vesta, Lilith, Pallas Athene, Ceres, the mother goddess, Chariklo, who's Chiron's wife. Chiron and Lilith were all taught in a separate class that I taught called The Goddesses of the Revolution, because I consider them sort of revolutionaries. And I also did Black Moon Lilith in that class. And, Venus is the primary goddess that I work with. And we can see that on February 1st, she's going to have a major conjunction. I've been talking a little bit about this in the last couple of videos, but she's going to have a conjunction to the North Node and Neptune. That is first Neptune, and then she applies to the North Node February 1st and February 2nd, which is also my birthday. And that kicks off her relationship to the North Node. Now, later at the end of last year, you can find I did a special report on the Venus-Pluto Ceres conjunction, which was on December 7th. So we've had these very significant conjunctions and that are dealing with very core soul orientations, right? Pluto, Ceres, Venus, right? And I talked about that in that video, which I'll just link it in the description in case you want to watch that. But then Venus herself is starting out this new cycle to the North Node. And that new cycle is also in relationship to Neptune, who is the ruler of the North Node, right? So we've got a very big new soul story happening relative to ultimate meaning and purpose and unconditional love in our lives. And Venus expresses that lower octave of Neptune, the conditional love element of like, okay, this is, for example, I mean, I can see this in my relationships where my relationship with my husband, I really thought like, oh, this is the one, this is my forever person. I'm going to be with him forever. And in a way we are co-parenting a child and we have a relationship, you know, that, but our marriage wasn't forever, right? It had a Saturn dimension of finality and it went through its own evolutionary journey. And that included for me a lot of disillusionment from the relationship. And that that ultimately taught me, though, in the relationship, the end of the Venus element of the relationship taught me the unconditional love element of the relationship, right? Most people, when they get divorced, it's very difficult to not convert a former lover into a hated person, right? Because often the conditions of the end of the relationship are some sort of betrayal, abandonment, some some long-term trauma in the relationship that leads to the change of form in the relationship, some sort of loss, right? There's grief associated with that. However, if we dig underneath all that grief, we will find that there is a lesson in unconditional love that is being formed. This can happen in our families. This can happen in in marriages. This can happen in work situations, right? Where we've given the power, right? Pluto has to do with power, the power of our identity to something outside of ourselves, right? And, you know, that ultimately, that change of form, that wounding, that, that loss, that grief schools us. It gives us a deep lesson in what it takes in order to know and live with unconditional love. And for some of us, that ends up, especially if you have children, becoming a lifelong lesson where we're having to learn acceptance, grace, uh, shifting our perceptions, forgiveness. Ultimately, if forgiveness is at play, we can know that the lessons of unconditional love are at play. That's what we're working with, right? And as much as we might say that we want that, these are one of the places where we can resist that at the deepest level. Because on some level there was a disappointment, right? A disillusionment of something that we were wanting. We were wanting that person to be our forever person. We were wanting that person to love and honor and respect us, right? All the vows. Marriage is especially good as an example for this, but it doesn't just apply to marriage situations, right? Pluto, of course, applies to all soul dynamics and all power dynamics, and that can happen in community. It can happen in social settings. It can happen, people becoming disillusioned by the church that they belong to or the spiritual family that they're a part of, the guru that they were following, or, whatever it is. What are we learning? We're learning lessons in unconditional love. What are we learning? We're learning lessons in where our source is. And the other goddesses are also doing very interesting things. So like Juno is trining, she's in Scorpio, she's trining this Neptune. And she's going to be in a retrograde in Scorpio for most of the year. So we end up really having a lot of source type lessons, right? Core material, core soul dynamics. So here we go. And when we're learning core soul dynamic lessons, when this is where we get to basically be unwound by, by life. I'm not saying that it has to be a painful process. It doesn't. It can be, though. I know for myself, it was quite a deep and painful process. And it elicited the deepest insecurity in me at that time, financial insecurity and, other forms of challenge to my basic emotional mental health well-being came up. And especially with Neptune stuff, it can become very unclear what's true and what's not true. Like the scope of reality, illusion and delusion, and all of that can be very destabilizing, right, to the nervous system. And I think a lot of where the goddesses are working this year is relative to the total transformation that we're going to be undergoing in the course of this year. So if we look at Juno and Vesta, both in Scorpio, right? Deep transformation. That's all in square to Chiron and Ceres in Aquarius. Where do we get our nourishment from? What is our mandate as healers, right? We have Lilith, who's opposite Mars, right? And we might be really dealing with some of the deeper feminine urges, sexual urges, desires that have been suppressed for a long, long time. What happens when we release those urges, right? When we are especially when our emotional bodies are tied to those urges and those urges are repressed for quite a long time. Look at Mars in square to Chiron. And, Mars is being ruled by the moon, which is also, I consider, a goddess, in her own right. The moon being the ultimate emotional goddess, right? So this year ahead, we're really working with quite a lot of pieces here, mainly being Venus's retrograde. We will have a conjunction of Lilith to Pluto, and that happens in March. We will have a square of Vesta to Chariklo. Now, Chariklo is the wife of Chiron, and she was considered his equal. And she, in her own right, points towards sort of being a healer and teacher and leader. But it can be really a lot of the development of our own capacities as a healer and a teacher and a leader, as an equal, right? We are not all conditioned to feel equal. And we can be unequal in many ways, not just in masculine, feminine dynamics. We can be unequal in resources, right? Two people starting a business at the same time. One of them has, venture capital funding that allows them to pay salaries and, do things. And the other has, $100 to their name. That difference doesn't make them equal. It makes them very unequal relative to the resources. However, it does not mean that the person with $100 to start with has the potential to be less successful than the person with, $100,000 of funding. Actually, the person with $100,000 of funding could just as easily run that business into the ground and be out of business in less than 3 years if the funds are mismanaged, if their leadership is not quality, if they're not meeting expectations. And the person who starts humbly with $100 could quite easily grow a nourishing, thriving business if the right values are leading the way, if their intentions are for healing and for good and to make a difference in the world. So don't let inequality deceive you into feeling it as an imbalance, but we can be desiring that equality for sure. And then Ceres will be moving in the sign of Pisces, and you can see that she comes towards a conjunction with Saturn, and that Saturn, and then after that, towards a conjunction with the North Node. And Ceres was big because she started off the conjunction with Pluto and Venus. So she's following Venus, and she's following Venus in her retrograde, right? There's a whole restructuring around our resources, our care, our nourishment, as it relates to that Pisces North Node, as it relates to how do we all get to a place, let's just say, if the goal in a utopia is a thriving life where we all as human beings are supported to be doing our creative calling and work. For those of us who have a lot of resources, they might be able to do it quite easily. But for those of us who are struggling financially, for folks who are under-resourced in the areas of support, for folks who are under-resourced in the areas of health, right? Wherever we are struggling to get our feet, to really ground ourselves in what would be necessary in order to take care of that reality, to create that reality, that's where these callings are going to be coming, right? And we can see that emphasized as well with Hygeia, who's moving towards Uranus this year. Hygeia is going to be conjunct Uranus, and a lot of what we are going to have to find our way back to are physical ways of dealing with anxiety, depression, sickness, illness, things like that, that are about embodiment, that are about care for the body, that are about tending our physical body and being able in that tending to reclaim parts of ourselves that have been lost, and being able in that embodiment to heal long-term trauma, things like that. There's a lot of advancement coming out right now in somatic work and things, where people are able to heal long-term relational trauma and things, unwind their nervous systems, and are finding their ways back to parts of themselves that have been lost because of, living in isolation or fear, or living, also I've seen a lot of things about people, where there's been environmental toxins. So this could also relate to healing environmental toxins like mold and living in disconnection from nature in that way, where we're maybe living in a more urban environment and not having enough time in nature, needing to be in a more slow pace of life. Part of what we're having to reevaluate in our life is like, where are we living? What are we doing in the home that we're doing? Is the home that we have serving our primary needs for connection with nature, connection with others, health and well-being, right? These are all different things that we can be exploring in this year ahead. Excuse me. There is a period of time where Vesta will be retrograde and Juno will be retrograde. And I think the Juno retrograde will be especially significant to all of the relationship transitions that we are going through in this year. And while that is happening, also Chariklo will be retrograde. And just like any other retrograde planet, when an asteroid goddess is retrograde, we're looking at that archetype being emphasized and there being an acceleration of soul growth around that archetype. So keep in mind that, just like the aspects of the major planets, these archetypal energies are having periods of time where they're strongly emphasized, where there's an intensity of growth or learning or development. Those may be beautiful times for you if you're wanting to connect with those particular archetypes, right? And they're also changing signs. So, for example, like Hygeia enters Gemini. And I do think that after we go through a period of reevaluation of our physical health, there can be a focus of reevaluation of our mental health, right? And Lilith enters Pisces, which might bring in a deeper connection to divine sensuality or sexual practice that is about connection with God or our source. Healing places where intimacy and sexuality have been previously taboo or off limits to us, or we've been disconnected from that element of that to be inherently it's not about seeking pleasure, it's about seeking connection with the divine, right? Ultimately, that's what all of us are seeking on some level, where we misplace that energy when we project it onto a partner or an other, right? But ultimate meaning is coming from that divine union with source. So there's a lot of growth around that. And I find it really interesting that during this particular time of the retrograde, we get Black Moon Lilith with Vesta. So there's an empowerment around our sacred service that is coming in. If our sacred service has to do with especially the transformative arts, like healing work, therapies, things like that. That is happening during a time when also Venus will be opposite those goddesses. And later on in the year, we will get Venus with Hygeia. So the two of those their conjunction. And we have Black Moon Lilith enters Sagittarius. A lot of that to me reflects the rewiring of our minds, orienting to where our belief systems are and what healthy thought patterns have been. And especially with Uranus entering Gemini later in this year, we're going to have a lot of new thoughts and ideas coming at us very fast. And if you've ever experienced a period of time where like you received a lot of information or, there can be an overload of information. We have to have some way to filter and digest that information Otherwise, we can kind of burn out on it. And you know, if that's something that if you're sort of an overthinker, then you'll want to have things in place, especially later on in this year, to help ground your thinking into the emotional body, to ground your processes into the physical body, right? That's also the time when Venus squares Mars, which I find, is a fascinating. Venus and Mars are always in a dance with one another. And in this midpoint of the year, Venus is in Mercury's sign. Mercury is retrograde. Mars is in Mercury's sign, and they're squaring one another. So this can also be reconciling of long-term conversations, arguments, fights, differences of perspective and opinion where people are actually at odds with one another, based on having these sort of basically, no one can win an argument if everyone wants to be right unless you're all in agreement. And if you think about it, then you have to ultimately decide, who am I? Do I want to be right or do I want to be happy? That's the question. And at that same time, Ceres, the mother goddess, is in Aries, and she's moving towards a conjunction to Chiron. So there can be a lot of triggering happening around our resources and our core nourishment and our core needs and desires, especially with Jupiter also in Cancer, that we're having to figure out, do I want to be right or do I want to be happy? Do I want to let go of something that's been, triggering me for a long time? Or do I want to get to the stance of where I feel vindicated? And one is going to take an immense amount of energy, and the other will release you into freedom pretty quickly. So it's just something to think about. Neither one is right nor wrong. We all have to follow our path. And I know I can be one to dig my heels into wanting to be right, as opposed to being happy. And it's definitely been a teacher for me. Later on in the year, we get a conjunction of Vesta with Juno and a trine of Jupiter and Venus. And I think this can be really helpful in creating the nourishing, emotional space in our life to actually ease some of the challenges of triggering, that might have been going on previously. Because also Venus will be moving towards a square with Chiron. Vesta and Juno will be coming back to the place that they were prior to the retrograde. So there's some sort of like wrapping up of a cycle there that happens and kind of brings the energy of culmination. And then we finally have Hygeia moving into the sign of Cancer. And that sort of core emotional nourishment. What I've seen, especially a lot of the times, for example, when people are dealing with things like breast cancer for like as a health issue, or any form of like feminine reproductive cancer, often in those cases, there is a long family history of that happening in the women. And there is also a long history of the women in the family having deep emotional suppression of trauma, or, it's like everything is linked. There's a book by a trauma therapist called The Body Keeps Score. There's a statement that says the issues are in the tissues. Well, this is true. I mean, we can know scientifically that we end up storing the unprocessed, undigested emotional traumas. And anyone looking out in the world today can recognize, like, the world is in a lot of trauma. If you're not specifically in crisis in your own life, guaranteed somebody who is. If you haven't specifically lost someone very close to you lately, guaranteed you know someone who did. If you haven't lost your home or, had a huge health crisis, guaranteed you know somebody who did. So we're all within like 6 degrees of separation to someone who is going through a crisis or experiencing a crisis ourselves. And that is a lot for human beings to hold. And honestly, we can't be expected to hold all of that without a lot more changes in the very core infrastructure of our support systems and our networks. And you'll notice that during this time of the year, especially, we have all of the Aquarius asteroid goddesses that are retrograde. So Lilith, Chariklo, Pallas Athene are all retrograde, moving back towards Pluto. And just keep in mind that whenever a planet's in Aquarius or in Leo, they're going to be squaring a Scorpio planet. Whenever a planet's in Cancer or Capricorn, right, they're going to be squaring an Aries or Libra planet. So we are still in this dynamic tension a lot of this year where these squares are being activated and challenging us. And it's, underlying the crises of consciousness, the crises of our ways of living. There's 4 kinds of crisis, right? There's a crisis of action, there's a crisis of identity, there's a crisis of consciousness, which can be related to the crisis of identity, and there is a crisis of being, right? Which can be like the soul, at the very core, the soul crisis. Those 4 crises can be activated at any given time. And these are, this is my perspective on this, that those 4 crises are impulses towards change and evolution. We experience one of those 4 crises at least once or twice in our adult life, if not more, and at least once or twice in our childhood, if not more. Some people, I think, do navigate more soul content than others. And, for those of us who are navigators, I'm a navigator. Are you a navigator? We are also here to be helpers in the healing of those crises. We're not here simply to suffer and then not know what to do with ourselves afterwards. We suffer for a purpose, and that purpose becomes revealed in our suffering and then becomes developed into a strength. And we can see that here with Saturn in a new phase to the North Node. Many of us will be learning tools, techniques, skills related to the feminine, because we're all in a water trine. They're all these water trines of the feminine, right? And Jupiter is involved in that water trine as well. We're learning tools to heal. That's the ultimate meaning and purpose of this year ahead. So I just wanted to give you a basic overview. For those of you who are joining me for the Goddess Within class series, you get access to all my core teachings on the 6 major goddesses. You can add on the goddesses of the revolution that, is available for you now. And if you join that, you'll get to join my live practice class where we'll actually be working with the transits of these goddesses to your natal chart, with the position of them in your natal chart. And it's a great way for you to integrate all the learning. So I hope that you'll join me. Classes on Friday, this Friday coming up. There's all kinds of free resources on my YouTube channel for you to learn about these goddesses, also on your own if you're interested. And I'll continue to weave them into my week ahead. So however you chose to join me, I look forward to being with you. Thanks so much, and bye for now.